Hello, and welcome to the first episode in our series of Back to Basics. In the introduction, we learned that there are 7 sacraments in all, and that there are 3 initiation sacraments. These are baptism, confirmation, and the Eucharist. Baptism is the first of these sacraments, and it's often called the door of the Church. It's the first not only in time, because usually people receive it as infants, but also in priority, because the reception of all of the other sacraments depends upon it. Father Richard Gibbons is our guest today, and he is the parish priest of Knock, County Mayo in Ireland. Knock is famous as a national Marian shrine. On the 21st of August 1879, Our Lady, St. Joseph and St. John the Evangelist appeared on the south gable of the church. Today, Knock is ranked among the major Marian shrines in the world. Father Richard, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Niall.
I suppose the first question, the most obvious question, has to be, why do we baptize?
It's a very good question. We baptize simply, I think you referred to it in your introduction, that it's basically a welcoming sacrament. You welcome somebody into the life of the church itself. So it echoes really Christ being baptized by John the Baptist in the River Jordan. That is the example he gave to us. So it's about initiating a lifelong commitment to faith, be that as a child or be that as an adult. So it's the door into the life of the church.
You mentioned adult and child. What's the difference between an adult baptism and the baptism of a child, or is there any?
Very little, if anything at all, indeed. The baptismal rite is still the baptismal rite, except possibly with an adult you go through possibly an RCIA program, an initiation program that helps an adult to understand why they're doing what they're doing and why they're giving the commitment, so it's a little bit longer. For a child, it's usually takes place sometime after birth, and the family simply sees this as an important aspect of their own faith and something that they'd like their child to be part of and to inherit.
Are there any circumstances in which baptism can or should be refused?
Well, very few, if any, really. We should always look on baptism as, I say, a moment that you can catechize and that you evangelize people. I know there may be certain situations, say, for example, maybe in some countries where parents want to get a child into a Catholic school and you kind of have to go and get the child baptized. And it might not be high on the priority, and they do it in a functional kind of a manner. But even in that instance, there's a moment. There's a possibility, rather than cutting off completely. In fact, Pope Francis has referred to that recently in Italy, where we mustn't look on ourselves as a kind of a small excellent few inhabiting a small church. That's mediocrity. We have to. We're a church of evangelization. That's what we're about. We're about spreading the word. So if somebody comes to me and wants their child baptized, and I kind of know, well, they're not really. I won't see them every Sunday. Still, it's a moment. It's a moment to engage with them. Otherwise, I wouldn't have that moment. If you blank that off, it's gone. It's finished. However, if you engage with the people, you cannot underestimate the grace and the power of God in that moment, and the way that the Lord works in situations like that. So it should always be looked on as a possible catechetical moment, as an evangelizing moment, and that's certainly in tune with what the Church wants to do.
Okay. And who can baptize? Is this sacrament particular to the priest?
It's not really, no. Indeed, anybody can baptize. It's not particular to the priest, but in custom and in normal practice, a priest or a bishop or a deacon can baptize. In cases of emergency, anyone can baptize. And so it's not particular to the priest itself. I suppose it's about understanding that this is, like I say, it's a welcoming sacrament. It's about simply portraying the church that it's a welcoming, open church, and that by taking part in this particular sacrament, that you're entering into the life of Christ himself, and that is so important for the individual.
Okay. And must baptism take place in a church?
It's recommended that it does, because I think, again, as you refer to the sacrament as the door into the church, the church itself, the whole point of the baptism is to welcome the child or the adult into the life of the church. And part of the life of the church, as you'll see during the expression and expression of the seven sacraments themselves, is within the context of the church building indeed, and within the community. That's where the community comes to worship. So the ideal location is a church, because that's where the community comes to worship. That's where we have our family of faith. And the child and adult is brought into the life of that family. So say, for example, you're having, after baptism, there's always a function or a party at home or whatever. You invite people to your home, into your home. You don't invite them out into a field. You invite them into your home where you live, where you explore your faith and where you explore your life. And this is your own personal home. So it's like that with baptism. You encourage them to come, have the child baptized in the life of the church, because that is where the community of faith gather. It's not the only place, of course, but that is other traditions of Christianity, baptized in running rivers, in pools, and by submersion and by immersion, and a whole host of different ways in the different traditions of the church itself. But in the West, you're invited into the family of faith in the church, and that's where it happens.
I've seen frequently, I don't know whether it happens all the time, but I have seen frequently baptism ceremonies where it actually starts at the door of the church with the celebrant greeting the parents, the godparents, and the baby. Is that symbolic?
It is. That's highly symbolic. In fact, I'm glad that you brought that up, because here in Knock, we do that. We actually begin at the door of the church. In fact, our baptismal font is at the door of the church. Originally, that's where the baptismal font should be, at the main door, because the main door of the church represents Jesus, represents Christ. So you're coming through Christ. You're being welcomed through him at the door of the church, which enters into his life and into the family of the church itself. I know some churches have the baptismal font up near the altar. That has more to do with practical reasons, like you're not freezing down at the main door of the church, especially in this country. It's different in Latin countries or in continental countries. But really, the baptismal font in the parish church here in Knock is located at the main door. And I always point that out. It's a very good point.
There are a number of symbols, signs used in the liturgy of baptism, such as water, oil, light, candle, white garment, and so on. Perhaps you could take us through the liturgy of baptism, explaining the various symbols. The ceremony itself it's a wonderful ceremony, because, like you say, it uses so many different symbols and aspects to it, and it's always important, I think, for a priest. I know when I perform the sacrament itself, celebrate the sacrament, that it's important to use these symbols and explain them to people, because sometimes they might not just get it. And again, it's a catechetical moment. It's a teaching moment. It's a moment where you can kind of make the thing a little bit alive. So we use, for example, oils. Oils are a sign of strengthening. It goes way back to ancient times indeed. If you're into ancient films like Gladiator or anything like that, ancient gladiators, ancient athletes would cover themselves from head to foot in oil. And that would be incorporated into the body, so to strengthen the body. So that symbol was taken over into the church as a sign of spiritual strengthening. And so the child or adult is anointed on the chest, and then later on with chrism on the head. We use water, of course. The water is the main aspect of baptism itself. Water is a symbol of purity.
It also echoes what happened to Jesus in the River Jordan by John the Baptist, where John the Baptist baptized Jesus. Not that he needed it, it was a teaching moment for us. So saying that this is an initiation moment. So it's the water itself, of course, our own bodies made up 75%, I think 80% of water. Water is the life source of all life itself. So it echoes that entering into eternal life and the life that comes beyond. So water is critical, and then it's poured, of course, 3 times on the individual's head. We use the lighted candle. Lighted candle represents Christ, the light of the world. And so we always, the child or the adult is encouraged then, the godparents hold the baptismal candle as a sign that Jesus is now with this individual right throughout their lives, from now until the time and including when they pass over into the next life. So it's a journey, it's an adventure, it's a pilgrimage, it's an exploration of faith, and Christ is always there, and that light of faith should always try to be kept burning or try to be encouraged. We use the white shawl. That goes way back to ancient times where people were baptized, as I say, sometimes in running rivers, in pools of water, that kind of thing. Adults in particular, initially, of course. And they went down one side, were baptized, came up the other. Somebody was there with a white shawl. Not only to cover their decency, as I say, but they're there to represent that something extraordinary has happened to the individual. And the white shawl represents that purity. It's a sign of purity, a sign that a new life has begun, that something has happened, something dynamic, that the Holy Spirit has entered into the life of this person, and that they're, to a certain extent, a changed person. And so there are all of these aspects. Even the baptismal font it represents, to a certain degree, the tomb of Jesus. Jesus himself referred to that baptism, and St. Paul refers to this, that baptism in Romans where we go down into the tomb with Jesus and come out again. So the baptismal font is kind of sort of a representation of that, or a type of tomb, if you like. And they move after baptism, you come out again into the Lord, into a risen state, to which we are all destined. And that's the hope that we have. And it leads from that, from birth to death, and across death into everlasting life, that the Lord is with us in all of these aspects.
The question I frequently hear being asked is, why do we need godparents?
That's a very good question. Again, godparents comes from a very, as I tell godparents when I'm baptizing myself, you come from a very long and ancient and noble line of a tradition. Around the time, if you take around the time of Jesus Christ, early Christianity, the average age of somebody living within the confines of the Roman Empire at the time was roughly around 30 to 35 years of age. If you live to that, it's very low for us today, but if you live to that, that was the average age, roughly. So parents were conscious at the time that maybe, unfortunately, maybe things may happen, so supplemental parents or additional parents or people that would take a specific role or responsibility for the child would come into effect within the unit of the family, of course, and extended family. So this was a tradition that carried on, but it evolved in terms of the understanding that, well, godparents are there to help the parents to raise the child in the Christian faith. It's a very deep spiritual nature to godparents. So it's a noble tradition, a noble line.
And what kind of people should godparents be?
Well, the best. Well, as good as possible. One of the godparents has to be a practicing Catholic, and I suppose if it's not just a kind of an honorary title, we'd hope. I know some godparents are brought in kind of an honorary role, really. But if it's explained to them, or if they understand that, look, there's a good spiritual dimension to this. You know, you're there not only to a sort of that the child or the adult is a special person in your life from here on in, but you're there to kind of maybe to deepen their faith, and by doing so, you actually deepen your own faith. So if you look on it like that, it's actually a challenge, it's an exploration, and it's an adventure. So it should always be looked on as that, because it's something unique and special. You never forget who your godparents are. Nobody ever does. They're very special people, and I suppose that enables you then to see, well, what is this about? Maybe I can explore this a little bit further. And it's always a grace moment of self-evangelization, if you like, and of deepening the faith.
Has total immersion totally gone out of favour? You referred to that earlier.
Oh, it does happen, absolutely. Like I say, in various traditions, there are kind of 4 ways that you can baptize. In the West here, it's at a baptismal font with the child, say, for example, and you pour the water 3 times in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, echoing the Lord's words. And in Eastern Orthodox faith, in Eastern Europe, say, in that kind of thing, there is baptism by immersion, where you place the individual or the child in water, and you still baptize, pour the water 3 times on the individual's head, or submersion, where you lower the individual 3 times into the water itself. Okay, so all of these, they all take place within the worldwide family of the Church in various different countries.
Traditionally, babies were given saints' names. Is this necessary?
It's not absolutely necessary. No, it's not. It's encouraged. Be it maybe the first Christian name or even the second Christian name. Sometimes that happens. Maybe parents would adopt names, and then maybe if it's kind of you'd encourage them, depending on what kind of, as we all know, like there are various different names in circulation, say in certainly in the music circles and all of that kind of thing. You can only, I think some of them can be, what is it, Pixie and Trixie and a few things like that. But it's encouraged that people would think about all of these things. So it's not necessary, but it's encouraged.
What happens when someone who is not baptized dies?
That's a very good question. I'm kind of exploring that myself. I wouldn't know, nobody knows exactly what happens. But sometimes it might be understood that we believe as Catholics or as Christians that if somebody isn't baptized, that there's some sort of something bad might happen to them. That's not the case. What we understand, if somebody is not baptized but wishes to be baptized, there's what we call a baptism by desire. So if the person who is, say, on the road to baptism, maybe something tragic might happen, they may die or whatever, the Church considers them baptized by desire because they're on that path already. Somebody that might not have the faith, that is not baptized and dies, we always say that we leave them up to the judgment and the mercy of God. It's in God's court. That's critically important because we're not in the position to judge anybody. We're not in the position to judge where people go after they die. That is entirely up to the mercy of God. That's the understanding of the mercy of God and the compassion of God himself.
And is this the reason why it is traditional for people to be baptized as infants, like soon after birth?
Yeah, that kind of goes back to an old custom. Well, it goes actually, the tradition of infant baptism goes back very early in the Church. A number of theologians refer to it, Tertullian and a number of others in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So it was common practice back then. And they said that goes back to the time of the apostles themselves when they were writing in those times. In terms of baptizing, it's understood that later on that just in case infant mortality, of course, was quite high. And there was maybe a common perception with parents and that kind of thing that, well, just in case anything happens to the child, we better have the child baptized. So that was the kind of the custom, just in case, because it was linked with, baptism is linked with salvation. And, but however, nowadays, of course, infant mortality is not as high. Parents are taking a little bit longer for a whole host of different reasons, be it their own faith, be it maybe they're just the influences of secular society might not certainly be high on the agenda immediately afterwards. There's a whole host of different myriad of reasons, really. But the tradition of baptism of infants and of children has always been there.
I've heard it said nowadays that certainly in this country and in a number of other countries that I've travelled in, that to some extent baptism has become almost a cultural event as opposed to a religious event. Do you see that happening?
I don't, not to a huge extent. We can always kind of sort of say maybe secularism has kind of encroached on a number of the sacraments. you can take weddings for the same thing. People just attend the wedding maybe to go to the afterwards. But again, the important thing is not to prejudge what goes on or what space people are at. The gospel should always be taken to where people are at, not where we would like them to be. Always where people are at, not where we'd like them to be. We'd all like them to be in the great place. But they're in their own particular places. So you have to accept that. But then use the moment, again, always as a catechetical, a teaching moment. You have them there. You have them for that particular space. There might be somebody at baptism that never saw the inside of a church for the last 10, 20 years. They're there. That's a good thing. And then you engage with that. But I don't see it completely usurped by secularism. Like you have, of course, some complaints, we get them every year in terms of maybe, overemphasis on clothing, people turning up in the lavish parties afterwards and that kind of, that's not taking away, and the children focusing on money and that kind of thing. To a certain degree, that was sort of always there. We might see a little bit more of it because of secular influences today. However, it's not that we cannot engage on a faith-based level with these things as well. And a lot of parishes use catechetical programs for parents for baptism and for the other sacraments as well, in preparing parents to understand what it is that they're celebrating.
Well, you've answered my last question. I was going to ask you, is there a preparation process, or should there be a preparation process? Is that obligatory, or is it just...
No, it's not obligatory, but a lot of parishes are bringing them in now, especially urban parishes, where on a particular Sunday in a month, they designate a particular Sunday in 1 month for, say, about 5 or 6 parents, so there are 5 or 6 children more often than not there to be baptized. So there are baptismal groups within the parish council that take parents for a certain number of weeks and just prepare them and get them to understand that. That's excellent. That's always good. And
finally, I see sometimes in some churches a refusal maybe is too strong a word, but a wish that there not be private baptisms, that baptisms should be a communal thing. Yeah. Is that the way it should be in your view?
There's always the ideal. Yes, the ideal is always in a communal setting, be that at a mass or whatever the case may be. But sometimes in rural parishes where you might just have one baptism every so often, every couple of months or whatever the case may be. And more often than not, families are so dispersed now, especially in Ireland, where immigration is back with us again. So family members maybe could be from Australia or America or Britain or whatever, need to get home. So you kind of have to adapt that accordingly. It might not always fit in with the ideal. Of course, the ultimate ideal is to always have somebody for baptism on Holy Saturday night. That's the epitome, because it incorporates so much that essence of resurrection, of new life, of baptism. It's linked in there, the essence of faith.
I know I said finally, but I've actually thought of something else that I'd like to ask you, and that is, what is the situation with the person who, let's just say they were born into the Anglican faith and they were baptized into the Anglican faith, and then at a later stage they become Catholic. Do they have to be baptized again?
No, they don't. No, absolutely not. No, baptism is once and for all. There may be a situation where somebody maybe that might be baptized Anglican or into another Christian denomination, they might not remember whether they were baptized or not, or have any documentation to that effect. So what takes place then is what's called a conditional baptism. That just takes place. No, absolutely, once you're baptized into Anglicanism or Lutheranism or whatever, we consider that you're baptized. You're baptized, yeah.
I do hope that those of you who have watched this have learned something more about baptism, that you maybe understand the sacrament better than perhaps you previously did. Well, Father Richard, thank you very much indeed for joining us today and for explaining the sacrament of baptism to us. In our next episode, we will talk about the sacrament of confirmation. Thank you for watching.